In the present, Mark was a ruthless businessman with hunger for power and wealth. His tech company was making waves in the industry, and he was hailed as a genius entrepreneur. However, Mark had a dark side that none of his colleagues knew. He was so obsessed with success that he had made some immoral decisions. He used his charm and wit to manipulate things for his benefit, and he didn't care who got hurt in the process. One day, Mark and his team came across a startup company that had developed a revolutionary new technology that could produce energy from the air. Mark was intrigued by the idea and decided to invest all his company's resources into the startup. Over the next few months, Mark worked tirelessly with the startup's founders to secure more funding and investors for the project. He put on a show, convincing people that the technology would soon become the norm in the energy industry. As more investors poured money into the project, the hype around it grew exponentially. Mark was ecstatic. He had envisioned the startup's success as his own, and he knew that his company's fortunes would soar as well. However, he knew that there was a catch. For the startup's technology to work, they needed to have the right equipment and resources. But Mark secretly held back vital materials that the startup needed. The startup company struggled to produce the right prototype of the machine, but Mark didn't do anything to rectify the situation. He watched as their dreams of developing successful technology crumbled. After several failed attempts, the startup company finally admitted that they couldn't develop the technology to work. The investors were stunned. They had invested millions of dollars on what turned out to be a fraud. Panic set in, and they demanded explanations. Mark saw the handwriting on the wall. His greed and recklessness had caused the investors to lose their fortunes. Mark tried to put on a brave face, but things quickly got out of hand. The media was all over the news of the startup's failure, and soon, reporters showed up at Mark's doorstep, demanding answers. Mark refused to talk to them, and his company's shares took a significant hit. The investors started to threaten legal action, and Mark's carefully constructed empire began to crumble right before his eyes. In the following weeks, Mark's life fell apart. His wife left him, his children disowned him, and he lost his empire. The investors had taken him to court, and he was found guilty of fraudulently inflating the startup's potential, bilking investors out of millions of dollars and keeping vital equipment from the startup. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison and ordered him to pay restitution to the investors. In prison, Mark had time to ponder the extent of his hubris. He realized that his greed and recklessness had destroyed everything he had ever worked for. He felt guilt and remorse, and he was consumed by a sense of despair. Mark knew he needed to change his ways, but he wasn't sure of how. Prison seemed to be the only chance he had to redeem himself. With time, Mark learned to adjust to life in jail. He met with fellow inmates, some of whom were in worse situations than he was. He shared stories with them, offered advice on how to cope with their new reality. Mark had been in jail for 4 years when he received a letter from his brother. His brother had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and had only months to live. He pleaded with Mark to come and be with him in his final days. Mark was conflicted. He had wanted to be with his brother since his diagnosis, but he didn't know if he was ready to face his family's wrath and the public backlash. After much contemplation, he decided to accept his brother's invitation. Mark's return to his hometown was a painful experience. He was greeted with cold stares and hostile tones. He tried to apologize to his family and the people he had wronged, but they weren't ready to forgive him. He spent most of his time by his brother's side, watching him wither away. His heart ached for his brother's plight, and he knew he had precious little time left with him. The experience with his brother softened Mark's heart. He came to realize the importance of human relationships and the need to make amends for his past mistakes. He knew that he needed to make a change, not just for his own sake, but for the sake of those he had wronged. After his brother passed away, Mark returned to prison a changed man. He met a group of fellow inmates who ran a rehabilitation program. After 5.5 years, Mark was finally released from prison. He knew that he had a lot to prove to the world, and he was determined to make his second chance count. Over the years, Mark became a member of a nonprofit organization. The organization focused on helping victims of financial scams, and he became a leading figure in the fight against financial fraud. People should learn to be content of what they have and don't take advantage of others. Finally, Mark realized he had found his calling. He had transformed from a greedy businessman who nearly destroyed his life and those of others to becoming a force for good in the world. Though the journey had been long and arduous, Mark knew it had been worth it. He had found peace and happiness at last.